It's Levi Brackman here with Truth, Jewish Wisdom for Today. Thank you so much for joining. Before I begin, if you like this podcast, please leave a review, like it wherever you find it, subscribe on YouTube, leave a comment that allows other people to find the podcast. Today is the final episode of my series on the Kabbalah. And this episode is going to be divided into 3 parts. The first part is wrapping up the discussion about the Kabbalah and talking about Tikkun. Then I'm going to talk about my reflections on the Kabbalah since I've started this series and my study over the last year of the Eitz Chaim and the Zohar, and reflections on appreciation for the Kabbalah as well as perhaps some internal struggles that I have on the Kabbalah. And then in the final part, I'm going to talk about next season and what that's going to bring. Let me first conclude the series of the Kabbalah and talk about Tikkun. And together with that, I want to talk about how Tikkun has really impacted my life, both in the past and also in the present. So the whole idea of shvirat hakelim that we talked about in the last couple of episodes, the breaking of the vessels, is the idea that these lights of the divine, which became vessels, if you recall in our conversation, the lights came out from the eyes of Adam Kadmon, of Ak, and then they went down through lower parts, through the lights which came out of the nose and the mouth, etc. And that took on a certain coarseness and which became vessels. And then those vessels broke and then they fell down into the world of Bria, the world of creation. And then Yitzira in the world of formation, and Asiyah, the world of action, until they fell into this physical world. So we have these sparks or these fragments of these vessels which fell down into this world. And these fragments, since they're vessels and they don't have the light in them, the only light that exists in them is the light that is keeping them going, if you like, so they don't entirely die and cease to exist. So that it's, to a certain sense, they are devoid of the divine. And according to Kabbalah Hari, according to Rabbi Isaac Luria's teachings, then what we need to do in this world is to elevate and fix these vessels. And by finding these sparks and elevating them, we put the vessels back together again, and we cause a recompletion of this breaking of the vessels. And that really is what it's all about. The idea is to find godliness and find the divine in this world. And by that, you're able to find these sparks, and then you re-elevate them and you create Tikkun. Tikkun means fixing, and you fix these vessels. And that has this cosmic effect, and that can bring about the redemption. So the Messianic age comes about when all these broken vessels are reassembled, and that is able to now put the Godhead back together, so to speak, and then we can have the Messianic age where divinity is now in revelation everywhere. So that is, in a nutshell, in very broad terms, the idea of Tikkun. So you have the shvirat, the breaking of the vessels, and then the work of the Kabbalist, and not just the Kabbalist, but anyone who's doing and performing mitzvot in this world is actually potentially elevating these sparks and doing tikkun and fixing the world. Now, this is also used by people in other Judaic movements, like the Reform movement and the Conservative movement, like to talk about this idea of tikkun olam, which is fixing the world. Tikkun olam is not really found as a concept in the Talmud. It's really a Kabbalistic concept, and it's borrowed by these people. It broadly means for them social justice, fixing the world, meaning taking the injustices and bringing justice towards them. And so that is how they read Tikkun Olam. It is not to be confused with the Kabbalistic idea of Tikkun, which is fixing these vessels and elevating the sparks of the vessels, the shards of the vessels that fell down, and thereby recompleting the vessels. And when that happens, the Messianic era is ushered in, an era where there's a revelation of divinity even in the lowest realms. So that is the idea of Tikkun. And everything which people do, every time you do a mitzvah, you make a blessing, you're potentially finding one of these broken pieces of vessels, these shards which fell down, and you're now elevating it and causing a step closer towards the cosmic completion of the universe, where we can have the idea of the whole world is revealed with the divine, and to fix the world in the kingship of the divine. And that is the purpose of it all. Now, sounds good. As a matter of fact, this idea was very important in the 1500s, and as the Jewish people went through some terrible suffering of pogroms in the 15, 16, 1700s, the idea that there's a purpose to it all, and that every mitzvah, every commandment, every good deed that one does potentially brings one a step closer to the Messianic age, was a very important idea. And to give some cosmic context to the whole thing is of really prime importance for these people, so that they could actually have a hope that the continuation of them living a Jewish life, studying the Torah and doing mitzvot, could bring them towards the redemption. There are those who argue that this concept came to its final conclusion with Shabtai Tzvi, with the false Messiah of Shabtai Tzvi, where he basically seemed to indicate this has now been completed and he was going to be the Messiah which everyone had waited for. The belief in this idea of Tikkun primed people at that time to actually believe that was actually possible, and that through these Kabbalistic ideas the Messiah was going to come. I'm going to leave that for people like Gershom Scholem and others to argue, and how the Kabbalah did or did not contribute in the degree to which it contributed to the Messianic fervor that took place at the time of Shabtai Tzvi, Sabbatianism as it is known. But post that, you ended up with this idea of Hasidism. And Hasidism, many people argue, is really Kabbalah, and it's found in the Baal Shem Tov, who was the founder of the Hasidic movement in the 1700s. He talks about that he actually met Messiah. He claimed to have had Aliyat HaNeshama. His soul would go up to the higher realms, and he went to a Messiah hangs out in the higher realms, and he met him, and he said to Messiah, "When are you coming, sir?" So he met Messiah, and he asked Messiah, "When are you coming? When will you be visiting the earth and bring about the redemption?" And Messiah answered him in the following way, according to the Baal Shem Tov, in a letter that he wrote to his brother-in-law, Gershon Kiteva. And he said, "When your well springs are spread out outside," and then crucially he said, "and when everybody able to miyached yichudi, everyone is able to cause the unification of unifications, like you are able to." And this is a Kabbalistic idea. We've discussed this many times in this podcast. The concept of the zivugim, when you have the masculine, the feminine, the shechina, kuchbricho shchinte, the Holy One, blessed be He, with His shechina is the feminine. Zah, the ze ampin, which is the small faces, which are the idea of tiferet, chesed, all the way down to yesod, which are these 6 attributes, shvirat. When they unify through yesod, through foundation, through the divine phallus, so to speak, with the femininity, with the shekhinah, when you're able to cause those kind of unifications, and everyone has the ability to create those unifications like you are, that's when the Messiah would come. And the Messiah says, when you can do that, when everyone talks about your teachings, and when everyone can cause the unifications above of Zan Nukva, of masculine, feminine, like you're able to, when everyone has that kind of theurgic ability, then the Messiah says, "I will come." Interesting, but the idea here, in other words, it's a new concept, that the whole idea of Hasidic teachings from the Baal Shem Tov were to also bring about the Messianic age. So in that sense, the Hasidic movement was also a Messianic movement. Now, none of that should come as any surprise because it was based on the Kabbalah, and the Kabbalah is the Messianic movement. If you think about from the idea of the Tzimtzum, the first contraction, all the way down to the breaking of the vessels and then fixing of them, it's all to bring about the Messianic age. One has to see the Kabbalah as a Messianic teaching. At least the Lurianic approached the Kabbalah as Messianic teachings. And then Chassidut in many ways was also Messianic teachings. So it was all about bringing about the Messiah, and that is the idea of fixing the entire world, where you have a world which is full of the divine and everyone is able to recognize the divine. Mala haaretz de'at Hashem, and that the whole world is filled with knowledge of the divine, as they say. This is really what Kabbalah is. It's a Messianic movement to bring about the Messianic age. To move on to talk about my reflections on this, because if this is what it's all driving at, I really have mixed feelings about it. In the very beginning of this series, I spoke about my own personal relationship with Chassidut and Kabbalah, and the episode was about a journey from Chassidut to Kabbalah through rationalism. And personally, I veer towards more of a rationalistic approach to most things. But that doesn't mean that I don't appreciate the metaphysical, and doesn't mean that I don't appreciate a lot of these ideas found in the Kabbalah. I really do. And I find them fascinating. And just a lot of it has a lot of deep wisdom, as I've expressed in this series. And I've described how a lot of these ideas lend themselves to understanding the human condition. And not just understanding the human condition, but giving us deep insight into how we operate and how we can actually be more successful in our lives and on multiple levels and facets of our lives, from our personal relationships all the way through to our business endeavors. These ideas give us insight, and clearly so, because these ideas come from people who were deeply introspective. These were people who fundamentally believed that mibasara echse Eloka, that from their flesh they can see God, and that humans were created in God's image. And the idea that humans were created in God's image is that through understanding humans, one can understand the divine. And it's clear to me from studying the Kabbalah that these were deeply introspective people who were very keen observers and students of the human condition. First and foremost, their own condition. And thereby being able to take some of those ideas and expressing them in the way in which that can explain the divine. And in that sense, the Kabbalah has a lot of psychology in it. And as a psychologist, one who studies psychology and has a PhD in psychology, I find that fascinating. It's not direct psychology, but it's indirect psychology. Everything that they're teaching is a reflection of their own introspection. And as keen observers of their own human condition and of the human condition in general, these are really fascinating and deeply insightful ideas, and very helpful for us as we want to live our lives and be successful. It's a mirror of showing who humans are on the deepest levels, the deepest recesses and secrets within the human condition, within our heart and soul, are being expressed in these pages. And so from that perspective, really very interesting, fascinating, and very useful ideas. That said, however, I still have a complicated relationship with it. Because when I was a young child, I lived through my own Messianic fervor. As I've mentioned, and I've quoted a few times, the Tanya recently, which is a book written by the first Rebbe of the Chabad Hasidic school, and I was brought up in that community, in the Chabad community. In fact, I still live in a neighborhood where a lot of Chabad community live, and my youngest children go to Chabad schools. In some sense, I'm still part of this Chabad community, although, as will become clear, and it should be clear here, that the ideas that I hold are not in keeping anymore with the ideas which are expressed by Chabad. But I was brought up in that community. And while I was brought up in that community, there was a Messianic fervor. And part of that Messianic fervor, I think, in many ways was a spillover from what took place during the Holocaust. So it can be very understandable why there was a Messianic fervor. the Holocaust took place, 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. It was a terrible time to be Jewish. Think about how difficult the last couple of months since October 7th has been. If you were a Jew living through the 1930s and 40s, every single day was an October 7th magnified and multiplied by many times. The gas chambers and ovens of Auschwitz were working overtime. Jews were being killed in the millions. So it was an incredibly difficult time to be Jewish. One can't imagine how people just didn't despair. Jews had to hold on to something. And Rabbi Joseph Isaac Schneerson, who was at that time during the Holocaust, he was the Chabad Rebbe, together with many others, felt that was the Chevle HaMoshiach. That was the birth pangs, the birth pains of the coming of the Messiah. There were others who felt that the creation of the State of Israel was the beginning of the coming of the Messiah. But whichever way you want to look at it, this was a Messianic idea which has its roots in the Kabbalah, without any doubt. And this was the belief that this is what happens with the Chevle Mashiach, just before the birth, a mother goes through tremendous pain. The idea here was that before the birth of the Messianic age, there's just a tremendous amount of pain that the Jewish people have to go through. And that's how it was rationalized. The Holocaust, this is Chevle Mashiach. These are the birth pains of the Messianic era. And they believed it. And one can't fault them for believing it. There had to be some kind of meaning they could make out of the unbelievable suffering, murder, carnage, and evil that the Jewish people were being put through. What is it? What could it be if not the birth pangs of Mashiach, of the Messiah? And that's what they believed. And when, in 1950, Joseph Isaac Schneerson, the 6th Rebbe of the Chabad Hasidic school, passed away, his son-in-law took over as the Chabad Rebbe. And it wasn't till the 1960s that my family, I was born in the 70s, but 1960s that my mother became part of that movement and joined it. And my uncle joined it. And then my family ended up joining it. My father never did, as I've mentioned. But the idea of the imminent coming of the Messiah was still there. This was the idea of the imminent coming of the Messiah was still there. And this was something that was continued to be spoken about. And this is where the shvirat hakelim, the breaking of the vessels, played a very important role. Because one of the explanations that was given for what still had to happen was that the last few remnants of these broken vessels still had to be elevated. And now is the time to redouble our effort to make sure that these last few vessels are elevated. And there was a whole theology which was created around that idea. And there was an analogy given, which was that it's like the soldier who's got all his clothes on and is ready to stand there to be inspected by the king. And all he needed to do was to polish the buttons. Zu putzen die Knöpfe in Yiddish means to polish the buttons. That's just that last little piece needs to be done. Everything else is in place. Just polishing the buttons is all that was needed. And then the Messiah would come. And it made perfect sense. Because if you believe in this whole idea of Tikkun, then when is it Tikkun going to happen? It's been 3,000 years in exile. The Jews have said mitzvot everywhere. They've done brachot and they've elevated these sparks. So part of the idea was Jews are now coming to America and they're going to create Judaism in America. This was the part of the world where maybe some of these vessels had fallen. And since Jews hadn't lived there previously, hadn't been doing lots of mitzvot in America, now if Jews are able to do mitzvot all over America, then they could find those pieces of broken vessels that had fallen in America and hadn't yet been elevated. And therefore, if we were able to conquer America with Judaism and with Torah and mitzvot, then they would find those pieces of broken vessels in America, elevate those, and that's it. That's all that needed to be done. And then it would finally usher in the Messianic era, as the Kabbalah had promised. And these ideas kept flowing. But Kabbalah does not make sense unless it brings about the Messiah. The whole Kabbalah only really makes sense if it brings a Messianic era. The whole idea of the creation of the world, and God wanted that he should be known in this world. If he's not known in this world, if you don't have a Mola Eretz Deus Hashem, that the whole world is full with the knowledge of the divine, if you don't have people being able to have access and know the well springs of the Baal Shem Tov, and being able to unify unifications like him, then the whole point of creation will never happen. So it has to usher in the Messianic era. So the whole idea of us taking these darkest parts of these vessels and elevating them back to their completed state in a higher realm, and then ushering the Messianic era, makes perfect sense if you buy into the Kabbalistic system. Without the coming of the Messiah, the Kabbalistic system does not make sense. It has to have the culmination of a Messiah. That offers people hope, and in that sense it's wonderful. But it has a flip side to it. And the flip side to it is that it brings about certain Messianic fervors, which end in three potential ways. One, with the Messiah actually coming. That has not occurred yet. So all the Messianic fervors that happened from Sabbatianism to the Messianic fervor that took place after the Holocaust, and I would say culminated with the death of Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the 7th Lubavitcher Rebbe, in the 1990s, and maybe continues with some. Perhaps the Messianic fervor of Rabbi Kook that he brought in when he maintained that the creation of the State of Israel was the beginning of the Geula, was Hitchalta de Geula, the beginning of the redemption. All of these things brought in a certain Messianic fervor. And they could either result in the coming of the Messiah, which none of them have as of yet, or they result in a deep disappointment and therefore a crisis, which is what happened after Sabbatianism. And finally, they can result in a new theology, which is that either the Messiah came and we just don't see him, or he passed away and he's coming back, or maybe he's still here in some kind of way, but he's still the Messiah. It results in various different forms of a new theology, which was different than the previous theology, because that new theology now has to explain how all the ideas and all the predictions relating to the coming of the Messiah never happened, and how this new paradigm, this new theology actually fits in with what actually didn't occur. And then people believe in that new theology. So now you have a change within an old religion to take into account predictions that never came to fruition. So those are the three things that could happen. Either the Messiah actually comes, and that hasn't happened yet. That result hasn't happened. Or there's a huge crisis. The biggest one was after it turned out the Shabtai Tzvi was not the Messiah. There was a huge crisis that took place in the Jewish world. Or a new theology comes out. So there's a change in the way Judaism is viewed, and Judaism has been to take into account the predictions that didn't come to fruition. Unless the Messiah actually comes, which hasn't happened yet, the other two, I feel, are not positive. So it's clear why the first one isn't positive. No one wants a massive crisis to take place. When Shabtai Tzvi wasn't the Messiah and it became clear that he wasn't the Messiah, he eventually converted to Islam, it was clear that he wasn't the Messiah. So, huge crisis for all the people who believed it. That caused tremendous damage to the Jewish psyche. So that definitely is a bad outcome. Now, the outcome of a changing theology I also consider to be a negative outcome. Not as bad as the crisis, but I still consider it to be a negative outcome. Because Judaism has a tremendous amount of wisdom to it. And whenever you replace one thing with the other, you lose something. So by creating a new type of theology, you actually lose something in the previous one. And that which is lost is very often never reclaimed. So to me, it's clear that is not necessarily a positive outcome. When it's new, it's new. It's no longer necessarily part of the ancient tradition. You have to reinterpret to fit new circumstances because the prediction never actually came to fruition. So to me, that isn't a positive. And then, obviously, if the Messiah actually came, that would be a positive. But you're in very dangerous territory when you're predicting that the Messiah might come about if certain things are done. Because what if you're wrong? You've got two potentially negative outcomes. Some might argue they're both very bad. One's certainly worse than the other. You can debate which one's worse. Now, I'm not saying that Judaism can't survive with a new theology, and I'm not saying that Judaism can't survive a crisis. And some might argue that the hope that is given to one by this Messianic movement, especially through deeply challenging times, it's worth it. Even if you're wrong, at least you sustain Judaism throughout these challenging times, and you sustain Jews with a belief in the coming of the Messiah. Better days are coming. You just need to prevail, continue being Jewish throughout these difficult times. One might argue that that's actually worth it, even if in the end the predictions don't come to fruition. I have mixed feelings about that particular argument. I'm not saying that the Kabbalists didn't believe in it. They clearly believed in it with a full heart. I'm not saying they were lying to people. Clearly, Joseph Isaac Schneerson believed, probably with his whole heart and complete faith, that the suffering in the Holocaust was the birth pangs of the Messiah. And that all he needed to do was come to America and send out his emissaries and get people to do mitzvot in America, and that would elevate the final shards of the broken vessels. I'm not saying these people lied. I'm just saying this is risky because you're making very big predictions about something that, yes, it's based on Kabbalistic teachings. It's not coming out of nowhere. But these predictions, should they be wrong, have very damaging consequences. Either huge crisis or a reinterpretation and therefore a new theology. Now, I'm well aware that this conclusion of my series in the Kabbalah might be somewhat controversial. I don't mean it to be. This isn't a criticism of any of the people that I've mentioned. It's just an analysis and why I personally have mixed feelings about the Kabbalah. These are clearly teachings of enlightened people. These are clearly teachings of people who have thought deeply about God and deeply introspected about themselves. But having lived through Messianic fervor and having been a student of history and now seeing the fruition of these teachings, what they result in, I have mixed feelings because on the one hand, they've been very positive. On the other hand, they've resulted in things which have been deeply challenging. So in that sense, we go back to our discussion about Maimonides. I think this is part of what Maimonides was worried about. I think this is also what a lot of the people who were anti-Kabbalah were worried about. They were worried about where it ends. What's the logical conclusion of all these teachings? And what that ultimately does to Judaism. I see those concerns as legitimate. I was sitting with a friend and his wife and my wife, and he turned to my wife and he said, "Did you think that your husband would ever be a Kabbalist?" And I immediately said, "I'm not a Kabbalist," which I am not. Studying the Kabbalah does not make me a Kabbalist. You have to be a practitioner of the Kabbalah to be a Kabbalist, and you have to believe wholeheartedly that what the Kabbalah is telling you is true to be a Kabbalist. I am neither of those. I'm not a practitioner of the Kabbalah, neither am I a true believer in the Kabbalah. But I do think that its teachings are very valuable, and one should study it the way I study it, in my view, which is you study it, and I have on my desk, by the way, so I continue to study it. I have the Zohar. There's an amazing translation with really good footnotes. I think there's no reason to read it in its original Aramaic when you have such a good translation by Daniel Matt. I have the Eitz Chaim as well on my desk, so something which I study and will continue to study. Clearly, I take tremendous value out of studying the Kabbalah, the Zohar, and its ancillary texts. However, the way I study it as part of the ideas of the Jewish tradition. That these are ideas which have been presented at certain times and through a certain epoch, a certain period of time in our history. And these ideas are very interesting, instructive, and part of a suggestion of how to read our tradition. But that doesn't mean that this is the fact about how the world is or how the world came into being. It can help you appreciate the divine. It can help you appreciate the human condition. And it can give you an idea of how Jews think about these ideas. But I think that's where it should end. It can get you and make you feel closer to God, and it will have an impact on you. But taking it to the next level could be dangerous. That's why I have mixed feelings about it. But it doesn't mean I'm going to stop studying it. I just caution about how one should study it. There's another aspect of it which I find challenging, and that is part of me, when I study it, can't get my head around why some of these ideas are not considered to be polytheism. As someone who really buys into the monodean concept of the divine, with all these different aspects of the divine, especially from my monodean perspective, I find it very difficult to understand how this is a puritanistic monotheism. It feels to me like there's lots of different aspects in the divine. And even in the divine essence itself, there seems to be different gradations, different aspects. And there's God before he desired the world to be created, and there's God after he desired the world to be created, and there's aspects within the divine. There's time periods in the divine when something happened and something occurred. Something must have caused that to occur. Was it really its essence? But what part of its essence? Can be the multiple parts of God's essence, and what does that mean? These are troubling questions to me. And I find that studying them is challenging to the puritanistic idea of monotheism that I am more inclined to believe in. That part of it I find challenging. I also find it difficult to believe wholeheartedly that any of this is anything more than somebody else's reflection of themselves, rather than anything real in the divine. But when I do read it, when I study it, I'm able to suspend my disbelief for that period of time. I think it's very hard to study these texts with skepticism. So you have to suspend your disbelief while you're studying it. But that doesn't mean that I fully buy into it. It means that I'm suspending my disbelief while I'm reading it in order to be able to appreciate it. It's a bit like reading fiction. You know the story never actually happened, but you want to enjoy the story anyway. So I read the Kabbalah in the same kind of way. I don't necessarily believe that this is what's happening in the divine, but I suspend my disbelief in it so that I can really enjoy the text. And then it adds value. It really does add value. Just like a good piece of fiction adds value to one's life. You can learn a lot from a good piece of fiction, especially if it's well written and it has insight. So I feel the Kabbalah is very similar, and I think that's how one should read it and study it. If one reads it factually and one reads it with wholehearted belief, it could result in a Messianic fervor, potentially, that could end up negative, as history has shown. And it could also result in a belief of a type of pluralism, challenge to the puritanistic type of monotheism that I think Judaism really promotes. So this has been my reflections on the Kabbalah, and I hope that's helpful. Now moving on to what we're going to talk about next season. So I'm going away from mysticism and going back to talk about Judaism from a more rationalistic perspective, but also from a very practical perspective. Since October 7th, I've looked around and realized that as a culture, we in the West have gone astray. We've really bought into a lot of the postmodern ideas from Derrida and other postmodern philosophers. The whole deconstructionist approach to things, where the periphery becomes a center and the center becomes a periphery, has really infiltrated almost every single aspect of our culture. It's a new set of ideas as opposed to some of the ancient ideas. And I think we're finding that the result of them are negative, not positive. So I want to do two things in the next series, and that is to explore what this postmodern concept really is, on the one hand, and on the other hand, contrast it with some of the more Judaic, what some might call Judeo-Christian, but Torah-based ideas. Ideas that are, I think, authentic to Judaism, and how, when we contrast the two, what the differences are. So a lot of ideas are going to be based on values, and I'm going to anchor each podcast episode in current events. So we'll see it from a perspective of current events, and then talk around the different perspectives from a postmodern, even a left-wing perspective, as opposed to an authentic Judaic, Torah-based perspective. Now, this is not going to be halakha, it's not going to be Jewish law. That's not what I'm going to be talking about. It's going to be values-based, not law-based. So the intricacies of do's and don'ts and how, with the spirit of these ideas, and then try to contrast it and try and then present a perspective, a cultural perspective, a values-based perspective, which is unique and authentic to Judaism and the Torah. So that's what the next series is going to be about. I'm really excited about that upcoming series and about doing it. And it's going to be a shift from the esoteric ideas of the Kabbalah. But I hope that it will gain a new audience and people who will appreciate this Judaic perspective on societal, cultural issues and values. And I think it's very valuable and very important. And I want to be a voice that contributes, a constructive voice to a society. There's another thing which motivates me to do this, and that is, since October 7th, I've looked around and I've seen the rise of anti-Semitism, which has been really challenging. I've seen what's gone on in campuses. Some of our elite universities are teaching ideas that are just so corrosive. I've seen how whole swaths of young people have gone astray. I've seen young people become enamored by Osama bin Laden's letter. And someone needs to counter this narrative. And who am I? I'm a small voice. I don't have a big audience. But I see a lot of people doing things to make a difference. People are going on missions to Israel and are donating their time and money to Israel. And there are people who are countering some of what's going on campus and advocating. And I've done some deep introspection and I've asked, what can I do? What can I do uniquely? And there are many things I can do and I am doing. But one of the things I'm sure I can do is talk. And I have a podcast and I have the desire to talk and express and teach. And therefore I feel that this is a contribution I can make to the society. And I hope that whoever hears it, it makes an impact. Maybe some people who need to hear it will hear it. And maybe just a few people will change their minds, or at least be exposed to different ideas. And that's the whole point. Doing my part to make the world a better place. Tikkun olam, fixing the world in a very practical sense. So I look forward to that season coming up, starting next week, or perhaps the week after. I might give myself 1 week break from the podcast. Meanwhile, this has been Levi Brackman with Truths, Jewish Wisdom for Today, wrapping up the season on the Kabbalah. Thank you so much for joining, and until next time.